welcome back. We're busy, in this clip we're busy with again activity that we placed online for you, and it's again exam related. I think you're going to become tired of me telling you every time it's important because it could be asked in exams. Now I'm going to read the question to you and then you can follow what I've done maybe on the whiteboard. Analyze with the aid of a diagram the tax incidence of an ad valorem tax, very important, levied on consumers of essential goods but also luxury goods. Now, important in this question is to realize we're asking you an ad valorem tax, okay? An ad valorem tax, analyze with the aid of a diagram the tax incidence of an ad valorem tax levied on consumers of essential goods but also luxury goods. Now remember, in case of essential goods they would be inelastic, it would be an inelastic demand. In the case of luxury goods it would be an elastic demand. So it's two cases. In the case of an ad valorem tax, this is obviously going to be like this: supply, price on that axis, quantity on that axis. Start off with the supply curve. Start with the supply. What is the impact on the supply side? Because the tax is levied on that side, an ad valorem tax. So an ad valorem tax is going to shift upwards, but it also pivots a little bit. In your case, in your textbooks, they look at a horizontal shift. A horizontal shift. It's a unit tax. But with the ad valorem tax, it pivots a little bit upwards. So very important. They can catch you in the exams with this question because you've got in your textbooks, there's no figure that looks like this one in your textbooks. Okay, that's why I'm showing you this. But take note also of the unit tax because that can also be asked in exams. Now in the first instance the demand is inelastic. So it's steeper. D1 is steeper. In the case of the second one, in the case of the luxury goods, it's more elastic. So it's going to be flatter. Draw this one, flatter, D2. And it intersects on the original supply curve. The two demand curves must intersect on the original supply curve so that we can see what happens. Please, students tend to differentiate. They tend to first do maybe the inelastic one and then on another figure they tend to show the more elastic one. It's not wrong. We'll still give you marks, but you might get 1 mark less. Okay, so if you can show us, because now it's much easier to answer this question. Now you can derive at the answer by the help of the diagram. Now what happens here is that there's the intersection, point E. What happens with the steeper one or the more inelastic one? There against that supply curve. You will see that the buyer's incidence or the buyer's burden lies there. Let's make that B. Let's make that C. You can give it whatever names you want to give it, as long as you derive at the correct answer. That's very important. So This block here is the buyer's tax share. This block here, that should be straight. Let's make it dots. Is the seller's part of the tax that's being carried. Okay, so this is the buyer's share of the tax that's being carried, and this is the seller's part of the tax being. What do you see? What do you see immediately with this? The buyer's share is much larger than the supplier's share. We talk of the Ramsey rule, the inverse elasticity rule, that the more inelastic, the less the burden on the seller, but the more the burden on the buyer. In the case of the more elastic one, it's just the opposite. In this case, again, get E, point E. In this case, go up. Sorry, there's there. That point there. Okay. Now you can see the buyer's share is much smaller against this whole box here. That's the seller's share. So in the case of a more elastic demand, the share is going to be bigger for the seller than on the buyer. And that is the inverse elasticity rule, or the Ramsey rule. Remember, with a more elastic curve, the demand side or the buyer side is more sensitive to price changes. With a more inelastic demand curve, the buyer is less sensitive to price changes. And for example, essential goods, they have to buy it, no matter what the price. Okay. With luxury goods, you can still budget. You still want to change your spending patterns as the price is going to change. And the impact on tax will also reflect that. So the change, remember, is first of all I always start with a more inelastic demand curve, because immediately I see the burden is larger on the buyer. The burden is much larger on the buyer, and it makes sense, because with an inelastic demand, the burden is going to be larger on the buyer, because the buyer needs bread, the buyer needs milk, okay, no matter what the price. Okay. In the case of a more elastic demand curve, it's just the opposite. Okay, it's just the opposite. The seller's share becomes now larger, and that's where the Ramsey rule comes into place, or the inverse elasticity rule. You must remember this also for exam purposes. So that's basically it. Just remember, again, I want to emphasize, this is a ad valorem tax. A ad valorem tax. If it was a unit tax, this shift would have been parallel. Unit tax. And that will be in your textbooks. You'll see that one is in your textbooks. But this one that I explained just now will not be in your textbooks. They'll show you the effect of a more inelastic demand curve against a more elastic demand curve. But it will be on a unit tax levied on the supply side. In this case, it is an ad valorem tax. Now, I have, for example, let me just look. We've done now Social Security again, and we've looked at taxation, what's the effect of a personal income tax. Now we've looked at the tax burden, how it's shared between the buyer and the seller. I want you, just for interest and also for exam purposes, to go and take a look what happens in terms of indifference curves, indifference curve analysis. If, for example, you levy a selective tax on a specific car, let's say a BMW, you levy a selective tax on the BMW but not on the other cars. What happens? What is the effect specifically? And then I also want you to look the same time at the effect of a general tax. Let's say you levy a general tax on all cars. What's going to happen? Okay, it is in your textbooks. Go and take a look at the chapter on excess burden, tax efficiency, tax administration. Go and take a look at that and give us some feedback. Get back to us online. Okay, my email address then is Robins, ROBINZ, at unisa.ac.za. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.